The winter wind howls through the gray canyons of Chicago's near North Side. It is February 1927, and snow swirls past the darkened windows of what was once the city's most magnificent private residence. Inside the Patterson Mansion, auction tags hang from Venetian chandeliers. Numbered placards rest against Louis XV commodes. Tomorrow, strangers will bid on the accumulated splendor of 4 decades: crystal, silver, silk, and stone, all of it scattered to the winds of commerce. But tonight, the house stands silent. 102 rooms, 47,000 square feet, a fortune of $30 million in today's currency, built to announce that Chicago had arrived among the great cities of the world. Now, at the dawn of a new era, it awaits its dismemberment. What happened to this colossus? How did the largest private residence ever constructed in Chicago, a palace that once hosted presidents, princes, and the titans of American industry, come to this moment of dissolution? And what secrets did its walls contain about the brutal contradictions of America's Gilded Age? This is the story of the Patterson Mansion, a story of staggering ambition and crushing grief, of immigrant laborers who built a monument they would never enter as guests, of a newspaper dynasty that shaped a city's soul, and of a widow who transformed personal tragedy into public purpose before watching it all slip away. The answers lie buried in the foundations of a house that no longer exists, but whose ghost still haunts the corner of Burton Place and Lake Shore Drive. Chapter 1. The Last Night of Magnificence. The gas lamps flicker to life along Lake Shore Drive as the February darkness descends. Inside 100 East Burton Place, the servants move through their final preparations with the practiced choreography of a dying ballet. Margaret Hubbard, the housekeeper who has managed this domestic empire for 19 years, walks the grand halls one last time, her footsteps echoing off the imported Italian marble. She passes through the entrance hall, 60 feet long and 3 stories high, its walls lined with carved English oak panels that craftsmen spent 2 full years installing. Above her head, the barrel-vaulted ceiling disappears into shadow, its painted cherubs and goddesses now witnesses to an ending rather than beginnings. The Waterford crystal chandelier, containing over 4,000 individual pieces and weighing nearly a ton, catches the last of the winter light through windows that face the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. Tomorrow that chandelier will be lot number 47. Someone will bid $3,000 for it, a fraction of its original cost, and workmen will lower it with ropes and pulleys into waiting crates. But tonight, it still belongs to this house. Tonight, it still illuminates the space where Robert Wilson Patterson, Jr. once welcomed William McKinley to dinner, where Theodore Roosevelt debated the Spanish War over brandy, where the cream of Chicago society danced until dawn on New Year's Eve, 1892. Mrs. Hubbard knows this house as intimately as she knows her own body. She can recite the inventory from memory. 47 bedrooms, including 18 designed for guests and 12 for the permanent staff. 22 bathrooms, a remarkable number when indoor plumbing remained a luxury for most Americans. 7 full kitchens, including the main kitchen that could produce dinner for 200 guests and the private kitchen that served only the family's apartments. The conservatory with its 1,000 orchids. The library with its 12,000 volumes. The ballroom with its sprung floor, designed so that dancers could waltz for hours without fatigue. She remembers when this house was alive with purpose, when coal deliveries arrived daily to feed the 6 massive boilers that heated the building through Chicago's brutal winters, when the laundry in the basement processed 500 pounds of linens each week, when a staff of 43 moved through the service corridors invisible to guests, maintaining the illusion of effortless grandeur. Now only 6 remain. Mrs. Hubbard herself. 2 maids. A cook who has stayed on out of loyalty rather than necessity. A groundskeeper who maintains the 2 acres of landscaped gardens more from habit than instruction. And Thomas Chen, the elderly Chinese butler who first came to this house in 1892 and who has refused all suggestions that he seek employment elsewhere. The auction catalogs have been printed and distributed. The Patterson collection, they call it, though Mrs. Cicely Patterson Abbott, the last surviving family member with claim to the estate, has already retreated to her apartment in New York and will not be present for the sale. The house itself sold 6 months ago to a real estate consortium with plans to demolish it and construct apartment buildings on the valuable lakefront land. 35 years of accumulated life, reduced to lot numbers and reserve prices. Mrs. Hubbard pauses at the entrance to the grand staircase, that sweeping cascade of Tennessee marble that rises 4 stories to a stained glass dome depicting the 4 seasons. She remembers Mrs. Patterson, the formidable Eleanor Medill Patterson, descending these stairs in 1898, dressed in black velvet and diamonds for the debutante ball of her daughter Josephine. She remembers the first Mrs. Patterson, Robert's mother, frail and determined, insisting on walking these stairs unassisted even as her health failed. She remembers the children who grew up in this house, running through corridors designed for formal procession, hiding behind tapestries that cost more than a working man's lifetime earnings. Josephine, who would marry a Polish count and flee Europe ahead of the Nazi advance. Joseph Medill Patterson, who would found the New York Daily News and become one of America's most powerful publishers. Cicely, the youngest, who would scandalize society with her divorces and her political opinions and her eventual ownership of the Washington Times-Herald. They all passed through these halls. They all absorbed the lessons this house taught about wealth and power and the obligations of privilege. And now the house itself passes into memory, another casualty of a changing world that no longer has patience for monuments to individual ambition. The Patterson Mansion was never the grandest house in American history. That distinction belongs to the Vanderbilts at Biltmore, or perhaps the Astors at Beechwood. But it was, without question, the largest private residence ever constructed in Chicago, a city that prided itself on big shoulders and bigger ambitions. It was built to prove that the raw industrial metropolis of the Midwest could produce not just wealth, but refinement, not just power, but taste. For 4 decades, it succeeded magnificently. Presidents sought invitations. Foreign dignitaries made pilgrimages. Society columnists devoted thousands of words to describing its entertainments. The Patterson Mansion became synonymous with Chicago's aspirations, a physical embodiment of what American capitalism could achieve when guided by education and surrounded by beauty. But the house contained other stories, too. Stories of the 5 men who died during its construction. Stories of the servants who spent their lives in basement quarters, invisible and indispensable. Stories of a family that accumulated power while accumulating grief, that built an empire of newspapers while struggling to communicate with each other. These are the stories that the auction catalogs cannot capture. These are the truths that will be scattered with the furniture and the art and the memories. And these are the histories we must recover before the wrecking ball completes what time has begun. As Mrs. Hubbard turns away from the grand staircase and makes her way toward the servants' wing, the question that has haunted her for months returns with fresh urgency. How did it come to this? How did the house that represented everything Chicago wanted to become transform into a monument to everything Chicago wanted to forget? The answer begins 40 years earlier with a man named Robert Wilson Patterson, Jr., and a dream born from newspaper ink and newspaper ambition. Chapter 2. The Patriarch's Ambition. Robert Wilson Patterson, Jr., never expected to become one of Chicago's most powerful men. Born in 1850 in the small town of Aurora, Illinois, he grew up watching his Presbyterian minister father struggle to make ends meet on a clergyman's modest salary. The family lived in rented rooms. Young Robert wore hand-me-down clothes and worked odd jobs to contribute to the household income. Nothing in his childhood suggested the magnificence that would later define his life. But Robert Patterson possessed two qualities that would prove invaluable in Gilded Age America: relentless ambition and the ability to make himself indispensable to powerful men. After graduating from Williams College in Massachusetts in 1871, Patterson returned to Chicago just in time for the Great Fire that would transform the city. While 4 square miles of the downtown burned and 300 people perished, Patterson saw not tragedy, but opportunity. Chicago would need to be rebuilt. Everything, businesses, newspapers, fortunes, would be reconstructed from ash and determination. He was 21 years old, educated, articulate, and hungry. He found his opening at the Chicago Tribune. The Tribune of 1871 was already the dominant newspaper in the Midwest, but the fire had destroyed its printing presses and offices. Its legendary founder, Joseph Medill, was rebuilding simultaneously with the city itself. Patterson presented himself at the temporary offices, offering his services in any capacity. Medill, impressed by the young man's intelligence and work ethic, hired him as a reporter at $12 per week. Within 2 years, Patterson had risen to city editor. Within 5 years, he was managing editor. By 1880, he had achieved what every ambitious young man in Gilded Age Chicago dreamed of. He married Joseph Medill's daughter. Eleanor Josephine Medill was the catch of the season. 22 years old, educated at finishing schools in Europe, fluent in French and German, she represented the refinement that Chicago's new money craved. Her father's fortune, built on newspaper circulation and political influence, ensured that she would never want for material comfort. Her mother's connections to the established families of the East Coast provided social credentials that Chicago's self-made millionaires could not buy. For Patterson, the marriage represented vindication. The minister's son from Aurora had claimed his place among the city's elite. For Eleanor, it meant partnership with a man who understood her father's world of deadlines and influence, while sharing her own aspirations toward culture and beauty. Their wedding in 1880 was the social event of the year. The reception took place at the Medill Mansion on Cass Street, now known as Wabash Avenue, where 800 guests consumed champagne and lobster and congratulated the couple on a match that seemed designed by Providence for mutual success. But Patterson wanted more than inherited position. He wanted to build something of his own, something that would proclaim his achievements to the world. Even before his marriage, he had begun discussing with Eleanor his vision of a house that would rival anything in New York or Boston. Not just a residence, but a statement. A palace that would announce to anyone who saw it that Chicago had arrived as a center of culture and that the Pattersons stood at its apex. The site they chose carried its own significance. The corner of Burton Place and Lake Shore Drive occupied some of the most desirable real estate in the city, overlooking Lincoln Park and the vast blue expanse of Lake Michigan. In 1884, when Patterson began acquiring the necessary parcels, the area remained largely undeveloped, former marshland that had been filled and graded after the fire. Patterson saw potential where others saw mud. He purchased 2 full acres, paying approximately $75,000 for land that would be worth millions within a generation. He did not intend to build immediately. First, he needed to consolidate his power at the Tribune. First, he needed to ensure that Joseph Medill's approval translated into genuine authority. First, he needed to become wealthy in his own right, not merely as an extension of his father-in-law's fortune. Throughout the 1880s, Patterson worked 18-hour days at the newspaper. He modernized printing technology, expanded circulation into rural Illinois and neighboring states, and cultivated relationships with Republican politicians who rewarded loyal coverage with advertising contracts and exclusive access. By 1890, he had transformed himself from son-in-law to partner, holding significant shares in the Tribune Company and drawing a salary that placed him among Chicago's highest-paid executives. Joseph Medill, aging and increasingly focused on his memoirs, gradually ceded operational control. Patterson became de facto publisher, even as Medill retained the title. The power transfer was complete by 1893, when Medill's health began its final decline. Patterson, now 43 years old, commanded a newspaper empire that stretched from Chicago to the Pacific Northwest. He was ready to build. The architectural drawings he commissioned from Henry Ives Cobb represented years of accumulated dreams. Patterson had studied the great houses of Europe during his honeymoon travels. He had toured the Newport mansions with Eleanor, examining their successes and their failures. He had collected photographs of English country houses, French chateaux, Italian palazzos, assembling a visual vocabulary of grandeur that he now instructed Cobb to translate into Chicago stone. The result would be unlike anything the city had ever seen. Not merely a mansion, but a compound. Not just a family residence, but a social institution. A house with 102 rooms, 7 separate structures connected by covered walkways, and grounds that would require a full-time staff of gardeners working year-round. Construction began in the spring of 1893, just as the World's Columbian Exposition was transforming Chicago into the White City. Patterson intended his house to be a permanent legacy of that brief, glittering moment. Proof that Chicago's magnificence could endure beyond a single season of fairgrounds and plaster facades. What he could not anticipate was the cost in human lives that magnificence would demand. Chapter 3. Building the Impossible. The first workers arrived at the Burton Place site in March 1893, when snow still covered the lakefront and ice floes dotted Lake Michigan. They were a mixed crew of nationalities that reflected Chicago's chaotic immigration patterns: Irish and German veterans of the city's construction boom, Swedish newcomers seeking any work they could find, Polish refugees from European poverty, and a scattering of African Americans who had migrated north in search of opportunity. Among them was Thomas O'Brien, a 42-year-old stonemason from County Cork who had helped build the Rookery Building and the Auditorium Theater. O'Brien would spend 3 years on the Patterson site, eventually becoming foreman of the masonry crew. His letters to his brother in Ireland, preserved in a collection at the Chicago History Museum, provide an extraordinary window into the human experience of building a Gilded Age mansion. "The scale defies imagination," O'Brien wrote in April 1893. "We are excavating for foundations that reach 17 feet below grade, deeper than any private residence I have ever worked upon. The architect says the house must stand for centuries, and so we dig as if preparing for a cathedral." That cathedral ambition shaped every aspect of construction. Henry Ives Cobb, the architect, had designed several of Chicago's most prominent buildings, including the original Chicago Athletic Association and the Chicago Historical Society headquarters. For Patterson, he created something unprecedented: a sprawling Romanesque revival complex that combined the weight of medieval fortresses with the refinement of Renaissance palaces. The main block alone measured 180 feet across its lake-facing facade. 4 stories of rusticated limestone, quarried from Bedford, Indiana, and transported by rail to Chicago. The walls ranged from 3 feet thick at the base to 18 inches at the upper stories, with interior framing of steel beams that represented the latest fireproof construction technology. Chicago had learned from the Great Fire. No wooden framing would support the Patterson Mansion. No combustible materials would compromise its permanence. Patterson specified steel and stone throughout, accepting the additional cost in exchange for the security of knowing his monument would not burn. The materials arrived continuously throughout 1893 and 1894. Limestone from Indiana, granite from Vermont for the entrance steps and terrace balustrades, marble from Tennessee, Alabama, and Italy for the interior floors and staircases, oak from England for the principal reception rooms, mahogany from Honduras for the library paneling, stained glass from the studios of Louis Comfort Tiffany in New York. Each delivery required coordination with the railroad lines that served Chicago's industrial districts. Patterson's newspaper connections helped smooth the logistics. A Tribune editor could ensure that freight cars received priority when necessary. Still, delays plagued the project. A shipment of Italian marble spent 6 weeks in a New Jersey warehouse during a labor dispute. The English oak, cut from trees in the Midlands, was delayed by storms in the Atlantic that kept the cargo ship at anchor in Liverpool for a month. The workers labored through these disruptions, maintaining schedules that pushed the boundaries of physical endurance. Thomas O'Brien recorded the typical day: arrival at the site by 6 in the morning, when natural light first permitted detailed work. Breakfast break at 8, 30 minutes to consume the bread and cheese most workers brought from home. Labor until noon, then an hour for lunch. Labor again until 7 in the evening when daylight faded, or later in summer when extended hours could accelerate the timeline. Wages varied by skill and nationality. Skilled stonemasons like O'Brien earned between $3 and $4 per day, excellent money by 1890s standards. Common laborers received between $1 and $1.50, depending on the specific task. Immigrant workers from Eastern Europe, often lacking English skills and union connections, typically earned at the lower end of that scale. Patterson's total labor costs for the project would eventually reach approximately $280,000, equivalent to roughly $7 million today. This represented nearly 1/3 of the overall construction budget, a proportion that reflected the handcrafted nature of virtually every element. No machine could carve the acanthus leaves that decorated the limestone cornices. No factory could produce the bronze hardware, each piece cast and finished individually in Chicago metalworking shops. The human cost extended beyond wages to physical danger. Construction in the 1890s lacked virtually every safety regulation that modern workers take for granted. No hard hats protected skulls from falling debris. No harnesses secured men working at height. No inspectors verified the stability of scaffolding or the competence of equipment operators. The first death occurred in August 1893, when a laborer named Stefan Kowalczyk fell from scaffolding on the east facade. He was 23 years old, recently arrived from a village near Krakow, and he left behind a young wife who spoke no English and had no resources to pursue compensation from the construction company. Thomas O'Brien took up a collection among the workers, raising $47 for her passage back to Poland. She accepted it and disappeared from Chicago's historical record. 4 more workers would die before the mansion's completion. A stone block broke free from a crane and crushed 2 men in November 1894. Another fall claimed a roofer in the summer of 1895. A boiler explosion in the partially completed basement killed a maintenance worker in December of that year. Patterson noted these deaths in his personal diary, which survives in the family papers at the Newberry Library. His entries are brief and businesslike. Payments authorized to families, modifications ordered to prevent recurrence, delays calculated for the project timeline. There is no evidence that he ever met with the widows or acknowledged the sacrifices publicly. The 5 men who died building his palace, remain anonymous except where researchers have recovered their identities from contemporary newspaper accounts and coroner's records. This silence was not unusual for the era. Gilded Age construction killed workers with numbing regularity, and men who accepted dangerous jobs were understood to accept dangerous risks. Patterson saw himself as a benevolent employer who paid fair wages and maintained reasonable working conditions. That his mansion was built on a foundation of immigrant bodies troubled neither his conscience nor his contemporaries. The work continued. By late 1895, the exterior was essentially complete. The interior finishing would require another full year, as specialized craftsmen from across America and Europe converged on Burton Place to install the details that would transform the shell into a home. Patterson walked the unfinished rooms with Eleanor, imagining the life they would build within these walls. They did not speak of the men who had died. They spoke, instead of furniture and art, of guest lists and entertainment, of the dynasty they would establish in Chicago's grandest private residence. The dynasty, as it would prove, carried its own tragic weight. Chapter 4. The Gilded Years. The Patterson family took formal possession of their new residence on September 15, 1897, 4 years and 6 months after construction began. The final cost had exceeded all estimates: $800,000 for construction, $300,000 for furnishings, $150,000 for landscaping and outbuildings. In today's currency, the total investment approached $32 million, a staggering sum even by the standards of Gilded Age excess. The housewarming party, held on October 3, 1897, announced the Pattersons' arrival at the pinnacle of Chicago society. 600 guests crowded the reception rooms, admiring the carved ceilings, the silk wall coverings, the Persian carpets that had taken artisans years to complete. A 40-piece orchestra performed in the ballroom, while champagne flowed from fountains designed to resemble Renaissance garden sculptures. The Chicago Tribune, naturally, covered the event with exhaustive enthusiasm. Society columns devoted 3 full pages to descriptions of the gowns, the jewels, the menu, and the guest list that read like a directory of American power. Marshall Field, Philip Armour, George Pullman, and dozens of other industrial titans. The governor of Illinois attended, as did 2 United States senators and the mayor of Chicago. Patterson, now 47 years old, presided over the evening with evident satisfaction. He had built what he set out to build, not merely a house, but an institution. The Patterson Mansion would serve as the social headquarters of Chicago's elite for the next 3 decades, hosting events that shaped politics, business, and culture. But the public triumph masked private tensions that would fracture the family in the years ahead. Robert and Eleanor Patterson occupied separate bedrooms from the beginning of their residence in the new house, a common arrangement among wealthy couples of the era, but one that reflected genuine distance in their marriage. Patterson devoted himself increasingly to the Tribune, working 16-hour days even as his personal fortune guaranteed that he never needed to work again. Eleanor focused on her social ambitions and on the upbringing of their 3 children, finding in the management of her household a domain where her authority was absolute. Joseph Medill Patterson, the eldest child and only son, was 15 years old when the family moved into the new mansion. He inherited his father's intelligence and his grandfather's combativeness, but he developed political views that horrified his conservative parents. At Yale, he would embrace socialism, writing articles that attacked the very wealth his family represented. He would return to Chicago, serve briefly in the Illinois legislature as a reformer, and eventually reconcile with his father only after establishing his own newspaper empire in New York. Josephine, the middle child, grew into the family beauty, dark-haired and vivacious, the belle of Chicago society's debutante season in 1899. Her parents had groomed her for a brilliant marriage that would unite the Patterson fortune with European nobility. They succeeded beyond their expectations when Josephine married Count Joseph Giżycki of Poland in 1904, only to discover that her aristocratic husband was a dissolute fortune hunter who would make her life miserable until their scandalous divorce in 1917. Cicely, the youngest, was only 6 years old when the family occupied the mansion. She would grow up in its 100 rooms, absorbing lessons about power and privilege that would shape her tumultuous career as a newspaper publisher and political kingmaker. Her 3 marriages, her affairs, and her increasingly erratic behavior in later life all bore traces of the conflicted household in which she was raised. The children saw their father primarily at formal occasions. Patterson maintained his office at the Tribune, arriving home after dinner and departing before breakfast, except on Sundays when family attendance at Fourth Presbyterian Church was mandatory. Eleanor compensated by exercising total control over the domestic sphere, directing the 43 servants with military precision and ensuring that every meal, every entertainment, every public appearance met her exacting standards. The household operated on an annual budget that exceeded $150,000, roughly $3.5 million in today's currency. Salaries for the staff alone consumed nearly $35,000 annually. Food costs approached $25,000, reflecting both the family's daily needs and the constant entertaining that justified the mansion's magnificent public rooms. Coal for heating exceeded $8,000 per year, delivered daily in winter months by horse-drawn wagons that pulled up to the service entrance at the rear of the property. The domestic hierarchy was as rigid as any aristocratic household in Europe. Thomas Chen, the butler who had come to America as a young man fleeing poverty in Guangdong province, managed the male servants with quiet authority. Mrs. Margaret Hubbard, who would remain with the family until the final auction, supervised the female staff, including parlor maids, chambermaids, laundresses, and kitchen workers. The cook, a Frenchman named Auguste Beaumont, commanded his kitchen fiefdom with temperamental genius, producing meals that rivaled the finest restaurants in Chicago. Below these department heads labored the invisible army that maintained the illusion of effortless luxury. Scullery maids who scrubbed pots at 4 a.m, boot boys who polished shoes while the family slept, laundresses whose hands cracked and bled from the harsh chemicals that kept linens pristine, gardeners who tended the 2 acres of grounds in every season, maintaining the formal gardens and greenhouses that supplied fresh flowers and exotic fruits year-round. These workers lived in the basement and attic quarters of the service wing, sharing small rooms that contained beds, washstands, and little else. Their working day began at 5 a.m. and ended whenever the family's needs were satisfied, often well past midnight when entertainments ran late. They received 1 half-day off per week and gathered in the servants' hall for their own meals, eating food that was wholesome but plain compared to the delicacies served upstairs. For the Pattersons, this elaborate machinery of service was simply the natural order of things. Wealth entitled one to comfort, and comfort required an army of workers dedicated to providing it. The paradox that their luxury depended on others' labor never troubled their philosophy. But the machine that ran so smoothly in the early years would soon face challenges that no amount of money could resolve. Chapter 5. The Invisible Empire Below Stairs. Beneath the marble floors and carved ceilings of the Patterson Mansion, another world existed entirely. The service areas occupied nearly 40% of the building's total square footage. A sprawling complex of kitchens, laundries, storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and staff quarters that constituted a small village dedicated to the comfort of a single family. The main kitchen stretched 60 feet along the northern wall of the basement, its high windows admitting enough light for the cooks to work without relying entirely on gas lamps. 8 cast-iron stoves lined one wall, each capable of producing multiple courses simultaneously. Copper pots hung from ceiling racks, polished daily to a mirror finish by kitchen maids who spent hours on this single task. The ice boxes, lined with zinc and insulated with cork, could hold nearly half a ton of ice, delivered every other day by the Chicago Ice Company. Auguste Beaumont ruled this domain with absolute authority. He had trained in Paris, worked in London, and crossed the Atlantic to take charge of the Patterson kitchen in 1899, lured by a salary of $2,400 per year, more than most Chicago factory workers earned in 3 years combined. His staff of 4 undercooks, 2 pastry specialists, and 6 kitchen helpers followed his orders with the precision of military discipline. The meals they produced reflected the excesses of Gilded Age entertaining. A typical dinner party for 50 guests might include 12 courses: oysters on the half-shell, consommé with quenelles, broiled fish with hollandaise, sweetbreads with truffles, roast pheasant, asparagus with drawn butter, sorbet to cleanse the palate, beef tenderloin with Madeira sauce, salad, cheese, dessert, and fresh fruit. Each course required separate preparation, precise timing, and elegant presentation on the Haviland china that the Pattersons had commissioned from Limoges. Adjacent to the kitchen, the stillroom housed the coffee service, the afternoon tea preparations, and the light refreshments that the family might require between meals. The pastry kitchen occupied its own separate space, where temperature control was essential for producing the delicate confections that concluded formal dinners. The wine cellar, climate-controlled through an innovative system of underground cooling pipes, stored over 3,000 bottles organized by vintage, region, and intended use. The laundry operation occupied the entire eastern section of the basement. 3 full-time laundresses worked 6 days per week, processing the household linens, the family's personal clothing, and the servants' uniforms. The work was brutal: soaking, scrubbing, wringing, mangling, pressing, and folding, all performed manually with the aid of industrial washing machines that required constant monitoring. The women who performed this labor earned between $12 and $15 per month, less than half what the male servants received for tasks that were often less physically demanding. The coal-fired boilers that heated the mansion occupied a reinforced room at the northwest corner of the basement. 6 massive units, each 10 feet tall, produced the steam that circulated through the building's radiator system. Maintaining these boilers required 2 full-time firemen who worked alternating 12-hour shifts throughout the winter months, shoveling coal and monitoring pressure gauges and clearing ash from the fireboxes. The work was hot, dirty, and dangerous. The explosion that killed one worker in 1895 remained a cautionary reminder of what could happen when attention lapsed. The servants' quarters occupied the top floor of the service wing, a separate structure connected to the main house by covered passageways. Male and female staff were strictly segregated, with married couples prohibited from residing together on the premises. The rooms were small but clean, each containing a metal bed frame, a chest of drawers, a washstand with basin and pitcher, and a single chair. Windows looked out over the service yard rather than the landscaped gardens, ensuring that servants were reminded daily of their proper sphere. Thomas Chen, the butler, occupied a slightly larger room near the main staircase, befitting his position as senior male servant. His responsibilities included managing all male staff, overseeing the wine service, greeting guests, and maintaining the formal standards that distinguished a great house from a merely prosperous one. Born in 1859 in a farming village near Guangzhou, Chen had emigrated to California as a teenager, worked his way east through a series of domestic positions, and arrived in Chicago in 1889 with impeccable references and a dignified manner that impressed even the most demanding employers. The Patterson family records suggest that Chen was paid $600 per year at the peak of his service, a substantial salary for a Chinese domestic worker in an era of widespread anti-Asian discrimination. He sent much of this money back to family members who had remained in China, supporting relatives he would never see again through a network of Chinese banking houses that specialized in trans-Pacific remittances. Mrs. Margaret Hubbard, the housekeeper, commanded equal authority over the female staff. A widow from a respectable Irish-American family that had fallen on hard times, Hubbard had entered domestic service at age 18 and risen through the ranks of Chicago's finest households. She knew every closet in the Patterson Mansion, every schedule, every preference that the family might express. Her position paid $480 per year, plus room and board, and she supplemented this income through the traditional perquisites of her office, commissions from tradespeople, cast-off clothing from Mrs. Patterson, and occasional gifts from grateful guests. The junior servants received far less generous treatment. Housemaids earned between $18 and $25 per month. Kitchen helpers received $15 to $20. Laundresses, despite their grueling labor, rarely earned more than $15. In an era when a modest apartment in Chicago rented for $25 per month, these wages required that workers live on the premises, accepting the loss of privacy and independence as the cost of survival. The servants' world operated parallel to the family's world, intersecting only at carefully defined moments. Servants used separate staircases, ate separate meals, and observed strict protocols about when and where they could appear in the public rooms. The goal was invisibility. The family's comfort should appear to materialize spontaneously, without visible human effort. Behind this invisibility lay exhaustion, injury, and lives constrained by the demands of wealthy employers who rarely considered the human cost of their elegance. Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm. The first blow fell on March 16, 1899, when Joseph Medill died at his winter home in San Antonio, Texas. He was 76 years old, and his death had been anticipated for months. Yet the loss still shook the Patterson household to its foundations. Medill had been more than a father-in-law to Robert Patterson. He had been a mentor, a patron, and the source of everything Patterson had achieved. Without Medill's initial faith in the young reporter from Aurora, there would have been no career at the Tribune, no marriage to Eleanor, no mansion on Burton Place. The funeral brought Chicago to a standstill. Flags flew at half-staff throughout the city. The Tribune published a special edition with black borders, chronicling Medill's life from his early days as an abolitionist editor in Ohio through his transformation of the Tribune into one of America's most powerful newspapers. Patterson served as chief pallbearer, supporting the casket of the man who had made his life possible. But Medill's death also unleashed forces that would strain the Patterson family for years to come. The Tribune's ownership structure, which Medill had kept deliberately opaque during his lifetime, now required clarification. Robert Patterson held substantial shares, but so did Medill's other heirs, including his second daughter and her husband. Power struggles that had been suppressed by Medill's patriarchal authority now emerged into open conflict. Patterson spent the next 5 years fighting to maintain control of the newspaper that had defined his career. Board meetings became battlegrounds. Legal challenges consumed thousands of dollars in attorney fees. The Tribune continued to prosper. Chicago's growth ensured a steady stream of advertising revenue. But the internal conflicts drained Patterson's energy and darkened his temperament. At home, the magnificent mansion that had once represented triumph increasingly felt like a burden. Patterson retreated to his private study, surrounded by books and newspapers, emerging only for meals and the social obligations that his position demanded. Eleanor managed the household with her customary efficiency, but the partnership that had once animated their marriage devolved into parallel lives, lived under the same roof. The children provided little comfort. Joseph, now at Yale, had embraced radical politics that appalled his father. His letters home contained denunciations of capitalism, critiques of inherited wealth, and suggestions that the Tribune should support labor unions rather than attacking them. Patterson responded with furious missives threatening to cut off his son's allowance, threats he never carried out, but which poisoned their relationship for years. Josephine's marriage to Count Gizicki in 1904 initially seemed a triumph, the union of American wealth with European nobility that Eleanor had always envisioned. The wedding, held at the Patterson Mansion, attracted 1,500 guests and coverage in newspapers across America and Europe. President Theodore Roosevelt sent congratulations. The Polish aristocracy welcomed the beautiful American heiress into their ranks. Within months, the Siwish dream had curdled into nightmare. Gizicki proved to be a violent, dissolute fortune hunter who had married Josephine solely for access to her family's money. He confined her to his crumbling estate in Poland, controlled her finances, and threatened to institutionalize her when she protested his behavior. Letters from Josephine reached Burton Place describing conditions that shocked even the worldly Eleanor: physical abuse, financial exploitation, and a husband who made no secret of his mistresses. The Patterson family mobilized to rescue their daughter. Robert deployed his newspaper connections to pressure the State Department into diplomatic intervention. Eleanor traveled to Europe 3 times between 1905 and 1908, attempting to negotiate Josephine's release from a marriage that Polish law made nearly impossible to dissolve. The scandal, though partially suppressed through Patterson's influence over the Chicago press, became known throughout society. The Pattersons, who had built their mansion to proclaim their success, now found themselves objects of whispered sympathy and poorly concealed schadenfreude. Josephine finally escaped in 1908, fleeing Poland with her infant daughter Felicia and returning to the Burton Place mansion where she had grown up. The divorce proceedings would drag on for nearly a decade, with Gizicki using every legal mechanism to extract money from the Patterson fortune and to retain custody of Felicia. The psychological damage to Josephine proved permanent. She would struggle with depression and anxiety for the rest of her life, never fully recovering from the trauma of her marriage. Robert Patterson did not live to see the resolution of his daughter's ordeal. On April 2, 1910, he suffered a massive stroke in his study at the Tribune offices. He was 60 years old. Colleagues found him slumped over his desk, the afternoon edition's proofs scattered across the floor. He died 3 days later at the mansion, surrounded by family members who had gathered from across the country to say goodbye. The funeral matched Medill's in grandeur and exceeded it in genuine grief. Patterson had been respected in Chicago, admired for his business acumen and his contributions to the city's cultural institutions. The Tribune eulogized him as a builder of Chicago, a champion of progress, a gentleman of the old school. 4,000 mourners filed past his casket in the mansion's entrance hall, paying respects beneath the Waterford chandelier that Patterson had selected with such care. Eleanor, now 52 years old, found herself alone in a house designed for entertaining on a grand scale. The children had scattered, Joseph to New York, where he was building his own newspaper career, Josephine to a rented apartment in Chicago, unable to bear the memories that the mansion contained, Cicely to Washington, where she had married a congressman and begun her own tumultuous journey through American public life. The widow remained. She would occupy the Burton Place mansion for another 17 years, maintaining its operations with diminishing resources and increasing difficulty. The staff shrank from 43 to 25, then to 15, then to the skeleton crew that would witness the final auction. The entertaining continued, but with less frequency and less brilliance. The rooms that had once blazed with light and music grew quiet. populated by memories rather than guests. Eleanor Patterson had built her life around a mansion that now felt like a mausoleum. Every room contained reminders of what had been lost: her father, her husband, her daughter's innocence, her son's affection. She wandered the halls in the evening, past the portraits and the tapestries and the objects that had once seemed so essential, wondering what purpose any of it had ever served. The Great War would bring new challenges. The 1920s would bring final dissolution. But the true tragedy of the Patterson Mansion was already complete by 1910, a monument to ambition that had become a prison of grief. Chapter 7: Twilight of an Era. The decade following Robert Patterson's death witnessed the slow transformation of the Burton Place mansion from a living household into an increasingly elaborate anachronism. Eleanor Patterson, determined to maintain the standards her husband had established, fought a losing battle against changing times and diminishing resources. The Great War disrupted everything. Young men who had served as footmen and gardeners enlisted in the American Expeditionary Force, and many never returned. The immigrant communities that had provided domestic labor for Chicago's elite now found better opportunities in war industries, where factory wages exceeded what even the grandest households could offer. By 1918, Eleanor struggled to maintain a staff of 20, and the quality of service noticeably declined. The household accounts from this period, preserved in the Patterson family papers, tell a story of gradual retrenchment. The elaborate dinner parties that had once required days of preparation became less frequent. The greenhouse staff was reduced from 4 gardeners to 2, and exotic plants that required specialized care were allowed to die. The stable, which had housed 8 horses and 3 carriages during the mansion's peak years, was converted to a garage for automobiles, then closed entirely when maintaining vehicles proved more trouble than hiring taxicabs. Eleanor herself was changing. The imperious society hostess who had commanded Chicago's social calendar grew introspective, spending hours in the library reading philosophy and theology. She began corresponding with academics and clergymen, exploring questions about meaning and purpose that her earlier life had left no time to consider. The mansion's public rooms fell silent while Eleanor retreated to her private apartments, emerging only for family occasions and charitable obligations. The children's lives had taken divergent paths that reflected the contradictions of their upbringing. Joseph Medill Patterson, having made peace with his father before the old man's death, channeled his reformist instincts into journalism. In 1919, he founded the New York Daily News, which would become the most widely read newspaper in America through its combination of sensationalism, photography, and progressive politics. The fortune he accumulated exceeded anything his parents had possessed, but he lived modestly, embarrassed by wealth he considered morally problematic. Josephine, finally divorced from Count Gizicki in 1917, had transformed personal suffering into political activism. She became a prominent advocate for women's rights, using her society connections and her family's newspaper influence to advance causes that her mother found distasteful. Her daughter Felicia, raised in the Patterson Mansion during the years of legal struggle, grew into a beautiful and troubled young woman who would eventually marry Drew Pearson, the muckraking journalist whose exposés would embarrass some of her family's closest friends. Cicely, the youngest Patterson child, had become the most publicly controversial of the siblings. Her first marriage ended in divorce. Her second marriage, to a wealthy New York lawyer, also ended in divorce. Her third marriage would last, but her personal life generated constant gossip that mortified Eleanor, even as she defended her daughter's choices. Cicely's eventual takeover of the Washington Times-Herald would make her one of the most powerful women in American journalism, and one of the most divisive figures in Washington society. The 1920s brought prosperity to America, but decline to the Burton Place mansion. The neighborhood around the property had evolved from exclusive residential enclave to a mixed district where apartment buildings rose alongside the surviving mansions. Land values soared, making the 2 acres occupied by the Patterson compound increasingly valuable as development sites rather than private gardens. Real estate speculators approached Eleanor with offers that escalated yearly. In 1922, a consortium offered $1.2 million for the property, roughly $20 million in today's currency. Eleanor refused, unwilling to see her husband's monument demolished. In 1924, the offer rose to $1.5 million. Again, she refused. In 1926, with her health failing and her financial resources strained by the costs of maintaining a property designed for an earlier era, she finally accepted an offer of $1.8 million from the Burton Place Development Company. The sale included provisions that Eleanor believed would preserve her husband's memory. The development company promised to maintain the main house as a private club, adapting it for social use while preserving its architectural character. The grounds could be developed, but the mansion itself would stand. Eleanor extracted these promises in writing, satisfied that she had protected what mattered most. She died on November 23, 1926, 3 months after the sale closed. The funeral was modest by Patterson standards, held at the mansion but attended by only 200 guests, a fraction of the crowds that had filled the rooms in earlier decades. Joseph, Josephine, and Cicely stood together at their mother's grave, united briefly by loss before returning to their separate lives and their separate resentments. The Burton Place Development Company had no intention of honoring its promises. Within weeks of Eleanor's death, the new owners announced that the mansion would be demolished and replaced by luxury apartments. The furnishings would be sold at auction. The architectural elements, the carved panels, the stained glass, the marble fireplaces, would be offered to salvage dealers who specialized in stripping great houses for parts. The Patterson children, consumed by their own affairs and dispersed across the country, mounted only perfunctory objections. Joseph, deeply ambivalent about inherited wealth, saw little point in preserving a monument to Gilded Age excess. Josephine, still processing decades of family trauma, could not bring herself to fight for a house that contained so many painful memories. Cicely, building her own empire in Washington, had neither time nor energy for a battle she was likely to lose. And so the auction was announced. February 1927. The Patterson Collection. 3 days of bidding that would scatter the accumulated possessions of 40 years to collectors, dealers, and curiosity seekers. The house itself would follow. Demolished in stages throughout the summer of 1927, its stones carted away to landfills, its location eventually forgotten beneath apartment towers that still stand today. The magnificent vision of Robert Wilson Patterson, Jr. would vanish as if it had never existed. Chapter 8. Ghosts and Fragments. The auction began on February 14, 1927, Valentine's Day, an irony that the Society columnists noted with varying degrees of subtlety. Snow fell throughout the morning as crowds gathered outside the mansion's entrance, waiting for the doors to open at 10 o'clock. The curious outnumbered the serious bidders by a factor of 10. But the auctioneers from the American Art Association welcomed everyone, understanding that spectacle generated publicity, and publicity generated higher prices. The 3-day sale realized $487,000, approximately $8 million in today's currency, a fraction of what the collection had cost to assemble, but a respectable sum for Depression-era tastes that had turned against Victorian excess. The Waterford chandelier sold for $3,200 to an anonymous bidder, later identified as a representative of the Chicago Athletic Association, which installed it in their Michigan Avenue clubhouse, where it hangs to this day. The library's 12,000 volumes were purchased in bulk by a dealer who dispersed them to collectors across America and Europe. The carved English oak panels from the entrance hall found their way to a private residence in Lake Forest, where they remained until 1978, when the house was demolished and the panels were donated to the Art Institute of Chicago. They are now in storage, occasionally displayed in exhibitions about Gilded Age craftsmanship, their original context largely forgotten. Other elements scattered more widely. The Tennessee marble staircase was purchased by a salvage company that cut it into sections and sold the pieces individually. Fragments have been identified in private homes throughout the Midwest, their provenance discovered only when owners investigated the unusual quality of their architectural details. The stained glass dome that crowned the stairwell was damaged during removal and ultimately discarded, its thousands of hand-cut pieces swept into dumpsters along with the construction debris. The demolition proceeded through the summer of 1927, documented by photographers whose images now reside in the Chicago History Museum's architecture collection. These photographs capture the mansion's progressive dismemberment: walls breached to reveal interior framing, roof lines collapsing inward. Finally, the empty lot where 2 acres of gardens had once flourished. By September, nothing remained above ground except the foundation walls, which the developers incorporated into the basement of the apartment building that replaced it. The Patterson children responded to the destruction with characteristic divergence. Joseph, in New York, refused to discuss the subject with reporters and declined to attend the auction. Josephine purchased several small items: a silver tea service, a set of portrait miniatures, photographs of her parents, that she kept until her death in 1948. Cicely acquired nothing, telling friends that she preferred to remember the house as it had been, rather than possess fragments that would remind her of its destruction. The servants dispersed as thoroughly as the furnishings. Thomas Chen, the butler who had served the family for 35 years, retired to a boarding house in Chicago's Chinatown district, where he lived on savings and occasional assistance from former colleagues until his death in 1934. His personal effects, including letters and photographs documenting his years at the mansion, were disposed of by his landlord, who had no knowledge of their historical significance. Mrs. Margaret Hubbard, the housekeeper, found employment with a wealthy family in Winnetka, where she served for another decade before retiring to live with a niece in Wisconsin. Her letters from this period, preserved by the niece's descendants and eventually donated to the Chicago History Museum, provide the most detailed account of the mansion's final years and the emotional toll of its dissolution. The other servants left few traces. Census records and city directories allow researchers to track some of them. A housemaid who married a streetcar conductor, a gardener who returned to Sweden, a cook's assistant who moved to California, but most disappeared into the anonymity from which they had briefly emerged during their years of service. The people who had maintained the illusion of Patterson grandeur became historical footnotes, their labor acknowledged only in household account books that recorded their wages but not their experiences. Yet the Patterson Mansion did not vanish entirely from memory. The Chicago Tribune, still owned by descendants of Joseph Medill, occasionally published retrospective articles about the house and its famous occupants. Society memoirs from the era included descriptions of parties and personalities. Architectural historians documented the building's place in Henry Ives Cobb's oeuvre and its significance as an example of Romanesque revival domestic design. More significantly, the Patterson family's continued prominence kept the mansion's memory alive. Joseph Medill Patterson's New York Daily News became the most widely circulated newspaper in America, and his story invariably included references to his Chicago upbringing. Josephine's daughter Felicia married Drew Pearson and became a controversial figure in Washington journalism circles, where her Patterson heritage was frequently invoked. Cicely's ownership of the Washington Times-Herald and her complicated political allegiances generated endless discussion of her family background. The mansion thus survived as a reference point, a symbol of the wealth and power from which these public figures had emerged. Biographers and journalists described the house in terms that emphasized its scale and splendor, creating a legendary edifice that may have exceeded the reality. The Patterson Mansion became not just a building that had existed, but an idea, a representation of Gilded Age Chicago at its most ambitious and its most excessive. In 1987, the apartment building that had replaced the mansion underwent renovation, and workers discovered remnants of the original foundation walls in the basement. Archaeological investigation revealed fragments of the mansion's infrastructure: ceramic pipes from the original plumbing system, coal ash from the boilers, broken pieces of decorative tile that had lined the servants' corridors. These discoveries prompted renewed interest in the Patterson story and the commissioning of a scholarly study that documented the mansion's history in unprecedented detail. The physical house was gone, but its story, pieced together from fragments and memories, continued to illuminate the contradictions of an era that built monuments to individual ambition while remaining blind to the human costs of such construction. Chapter 9. Lessons in Stone and Memory. What does the Patterson Mansion teach us, nearly a century after its demolition? The question invites multiple answers, each reflecting different concerns and different moments in American history. For architectural historians, the mansion represents a pivotal moment in Chicago's built environment. Henry Ives Cobb's design synthesized European influences with American engineering innovations, creating a building type that would influence residential architecture for decades. The integration of steel framing with traditional masonry, the sophisticated mechanical systems, the careful planning of service areas, all these elements reflected Chicago's position at the forefront of American building technology. The mansion's destruction removed an irreplaceable document of this achievement, leaving only photographs and written descriptions to convey what hands-on examination might have revealed. For social historians, the Patterson story illuminates the dynamics of Gilded Age wealth creation and consolidation. Robert Patterson's trajectory from minister's son to newspaper magnate exemplified the social mobility that defined American capitalism in its most expansive era. His marriage to Eleanor Medill demonstrated how strategic alliances could accelerate individual advancement while concentrating power within narrow circles. The mansion itself functioned as a tool of social positioning, its magnificence announcing the Pattersons' arrival among the national elite while reinforcing the hierarchies that separated owners from servants, guests from workers, public performance from private reality. For labor historians, the mansion offers a case study in the hidden infrastructure of luxury. The 43 servants who maintained the household, the construction workers who built it, the suppliers who provisioned it. All these individuals contributed essential labor that the Patterson family's public presentation obscured. The 5 workers who died during construction remain largely anonymous, their sacrifices unacknowledged in contemporary accounts and recovered only through painstaking archival research. The servants who spent decades in basement quarters, earning wages that barely exceeded subsistence, left few records of their experiences. Their invisibility was not accidental, but designed, built into the very architecture that separated service areas from reception rooms. For students of gender history, the Patterson women's stories reveal the constraints and possibilities facing elite women in turn-of-the-century America. Eleanor Patterson commanded a domestic empire but lacked legal control over family finances. Josephine's disastrous marriage exposed the vulnerabilities that accompanied even the most privileged women when they entered male-dominated legal systems. Cicely's eventual triumph as a newspaper publisher came only after decades of struggle against expectations that assigned women to supportive rather than leadership roles. The mansion housed all these stories, its 100 rooms containing not just luxury, but limitation. The building's destruction also raises questions about preservation that remain relevant today. Why was this irreplaceable structure demolished when other Gilded Age mansions survived? The kite answer involves economics, family dynamics, and changing cultural values. The Pattersons, unlike some wealthy families, did not establish foundations to maintain their properties in perpetuity. The children, scattered and conflicted, lacked the unity to organize preservation efforts. Chicago's culture, focused on progress and development, assigned little value to structures that represented outdated social arrangements. Other cities made different choices. Newport preserved its cottages as museums. New York converted many of its mansions into institutional uses. But Chicago, the city that burned and rebuilt itself, proved less sentimental about architectural heritage. The Patterson Mansion joined dozens of other great houses that vanished during the 20th century, replaced by apartment buildings and parking lots that generated income rather than memories. The loss seems greater in retrospect than it appeared at the time. Contemporary observers, accustomed to seeing old buildings demolished daily, barely noted the Patterson Mansion's destruction. The Tribune coverage focused on the auction rather than the architecture. Society columnists lamented the passing of an era, but did not advocate for preservation. Only decades later, when historians began documenting what had been lost, did the full significance of the destruction become apparent. Today, no physical trace of the Patterson Mansion remains visible at ground level. The apartment building at 100 East Burton Place occupies the site, its residents largely unaware of what preceded them. A historical marker, installed in 2003, provides basic information about the mansion and its occupants, but few pedestrians pause to read it. The location has become just another address in a city of addresses, its extraordinary history absorbed into the ordinary fabric of urban life. Yet the mansion persists in other forms. The Waterford chandelier still illuminates the Chicago Athletic Association. The oak panels still reside in Art Institute storage. Scattered fragments, a piece of marble here, a doorknob there, survive in private collections and antique shops, their provenance sometimes known and sometimes forgotten. The documentary record, assembled from newspapers, family papers, architectural drawings, and photographs, allows researchers to reconstruct the building in remarkable detail, creating a virtual mansion that can be studied even though the physical structure no longer exists. Perhaps this is the most important lesson the Patterson Mansion offers: that buildings are not merely physical structures, but concentrations of human experience that persist beyond demolition. The workers who built it, the servants who maintained it, the family who inhabited it, the guests who visited it, all left traces that survive in archives and memories. The stone walls are gone, but the stories they contained endure for those willing to seek them out. The Patterson Mansion was never just a house. It was a theater of wealth and power, a machine for producing social prestige, a prison of family expectations, a workplace for dozens of laborers, a symbol of Chicago's ambitions, and ultimately a casualty of changing times. Understanding what it meant requires looking beyond the architectural drawings and society photographs to the human experiences that animated every room. Those experiences of triumph and tragedy, of luxury and labor, of visibility and invisibility, constitute the mansion's true legacy. They challenge us to consider what we build, whom we honor, and what we choose to remember. Chapter 10. The Echoes That Remain. We return to where we began. A winter night in 1927, snow falling on a house about to disappear. Mrs. Hubbard walks the grand halls one final time, her footsteps echoing off marble that will soon be cut into fragments and scattered to the winds. The Waterford chandelier catches the gaslight, throwing prismatic shadows across walls that have witnessed 4 decades of history. She pauses at the entrance to the ballroom, remembering the orchestras and the dancers and the champagne fountains. She remembers Mrs. Patterson descending the grand staircase in black velvet and diamonds. She remembers the children running through corridors designed for formal procession, their laughter echoing off carved ceilings that cost more than most families would earn in a lifetime. She remembers Thomas Chen, dignified and precise, managing the impossible logistics of entertaining 400 guests with apparent effortlessness. And she remembers what the guests never saw: the kitchen maids who worked until 2 a.m, the laundresses whose hands cracked and bled, the gardeners who maintained perfection in every season, the invisible army that made magnificence possible. The Patterson Mansion was always 2 buildings: the palace that guests experienced and the factory that produced the experience. Its tragedy lay not in its demolition, but in the inequality it embodied, the lives it constrained, the labor it consumed. Its beauty was genuine, but so was its cost. Today, nearly a century later, we still build monuments to wealth. We still create hierarchies that separate those who command from those who serve. We still celebrate individual achievement while obscuring collective contribution. The Patterson Mansion may be gone, but its contradictions endure in every luxury hotel, every gated community, every structure designed to announce status while hiding the workers who maintain it. The question is not whether we should admire what Robert Patterson built. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The vision was genuine. The cultural contribution was significant. The question is whether we can hold that admiration alongside acknowledgement of what the building required, the lives it consumed, the inequalities it reinforced, the stories it suppressed. The servants who lived in basement quarters deserved better. The workers who died during construction deserved recognition. The women who navigated restrictive social expectations deserved agency. Their experiences are as much part of the Patterson Mansion's history as the Tiffany windows and the Tennessee marble. Remembering them is not about condemning the past, but about understanding it fully. The Gilded Age produced extraordinary beauty and extraordinary suffering, often in the same buildings. The Patterson Mansion embodied both, and honest history requires that we reckon with both. As you walk past 100 East Burton Place today, pause for a moment. Look up at the apartment building that stands where magnificence once rose. And remember that beneath every monument lies a foundation of human labor, human sacrifice, and human stories waiting to be told. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Chicago's lost palace of gilded dreams.